In the summer of 1990, a 13-year-old Texas girl named Deanna is doing her best, living in a difficult situation, but also trying to just be a regular teenage girl. One night, she sneaks out of the house to visit her twin sister, who is staying with a relative. They chat for a bit before the relative wakes up and tells her to head back home. But Deanna would never make it back home that night. Her case has a lot of problems, including that it's had various times where it hasn't been investigated at all. It's also had a lot of red herrings, distractions that remain prevalent in the narrative that the public hears. In this episode, I'm joined by Deanna's younger sister, Melissa, the person who is working so hard to push her case forward, and she wants to set the record straight so that people are focusing on the right things moving forward, the pieces that could help bring her and her family long-awaited answers. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the disappearance of Deanna Merryfield. Deanna Michelle Merryfield was born on Groundhog's Day, February 2nd, 1977, alongside her fraternal twin sister Rebecca, who goes by Becky. The twins joined an older sister Amy, and a couple of years later, they welcomed their younger sister Melissa, the sister who I'm so thankful joined me to bring you this episode. The Merryfield girls grew up with their mother in Killeen, Texas. Here's Melissa telling me a bit about what it was like to grow up there and how it is now.
In the 80s and 90s, Killeen was kind of a small town compared to now. It was, 50,000, 60,000 people back then. We definitely ran the streets, until the lights came on, like you said. Um, and it was primarily military. It's right next to, back then it was Fort Hood, now it's Fort Cavazos. And so the locals, the people that weren't military, kind of a lot of us knew each other and grew up with each other, and we kind of stuck together because, those were the faces that you saw throughout the years. So there was it had drug problems, it had crime problems, and now they're even worse. And it's grown a lot. It's like 150,000, 160,000, something like that now. In the early 90s, actually within weeks of Deanna going missing, the Gulf War was beginning and Fort Hood just kind of cleared out. Like there was a lot of businesses that were closing and stuff because they didn't have that military to kind of support the businesses and stuff. So
If you do a cursory search of Deanna's name on the internet, your quick takeaway will be that she came from a troubled household and was going through a rough patch. And while that is true, there is so much more to Deanna and her story. So that's where I asked Melissa to start. To start by telling me about Deanna and what memories she has of being her little sister.
yeah, so I had turned 11 5 days before she went missing. So I was really young. I remember her being fun to hang out with. I remember that I was the youngest of four girls, and I always wanted to tag along, and Deanna would let me tag along. The other girls were like, because a lot of times I'd run home and tattle. Um, but Deanna was really, really smart. She was like in the gifted program and really sweet when she was younger. Our mother married our stepfather in 1986, and that's kind of when things started going downhill for Deanna. When she was by the end of her fifth grade year, she was like, making bad grades, and her teachers are like, she's not applying herself, things like that. She was, when we were young, very sweet, very fun. As she got older, she was very protective of me and liked like rock music and kind of turned, she was 13, so she was turning into a teenager.
I've been alluding to Deanna's circumstances, but haven't given you the full picture yet. In here, you can tell Melissa's starting to foreshadow the direction their life went in after her mother married a man named Roy. As a content warning, the rest of this episode will have some discussion relating to sexual abuse of a minor, as well as references of substance use disorder. Given the heaviness of those topics, I wanted to tread carefully and only include what Melissa felt comfortable sharing. But Melissa found it important to share this information.
Yeah, no, I'm okay with sharing it because it kind of adds a lot of context to Deanna's story.
It's my personal opinion after researching this case and talking to Melissa that you cannot separate out Deanna's disappearance from everything that was going on with her life. Our life circumstances shape how we do life, who we hang out with, what we do for fun, what we do to feel safe, what we avoid. And that's even more significant when you're an adolescent who is still developing and learning all those things for yourself. Here's Melissa discussing what life was like and what Deanna was experiencing leading up to her disappearance.
In 1989, our mother, she was an alcoholic, and she was hospitalized due to complications of cirrhosis of the liver. So that left us four girls at home with Roy, and Becky and Deanna snuck out of the house to go tell our grandmother and our aunt that Roy was abusing them. So, our mom got out of the hospital shortly after. CPS was investigating, and they told our mom, while we're investigating, Roy cannot be around the girls. So she sent us to live with relatives, various relatives. And so that is how Deanna ended up at our grandmother's house. In October of 1989, Roy was convicted of sexual abuse of Deanna. The other two, there wasn't enough evidence, and then one of them also recanted.
Just as a quick side note, this is not uncommon. Various studies have been conducted on rates of recantation amongst children who have disclosed sexual abuse, and the statistics vary, but a law school study published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry found that denials were especially likely among younger children, children abused by someone living in the home, and children whose mothers were unsupportive.
So he was convicted of abusing her, was given 10 years probation, and has to register as a sex offender for life. I guess at that point they said that we could go back home, which I'm not sure what the thinking was in that, but so I went back home, and Deanna basically said she will never go back home. I don't know if that was, she wasn't allowed to go home because it was her case that resulted in a conviction or what, but either way, she wasn't going to go back home.
During the summer of 1990, Deanna moved in with her grandmother in a home on Alamo Avenue in Killeen. Deanna's twin sister Becky stayed with an uncle in the Oak Springs Trailer Park in the 500 block of Dimple Street in Killeen. I'll have a map of this path on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod, but to give you an idea, the locations are roughly 2.5 miles apart. Deanna's older sister Amy was staying up with a relative in Virginia for the summer, and as Melissa shared, she was at home with her mom and Roy. Given the problems within their nuclear household, these places with relatives were safe havens for the girls, and Deanna was particularly close with her grandmother.
She was a strong, positive person in their lives.
In fact, on the night of July 21st, 1990, into the early morning hours of July 22nd, Deanna was spending time with her grandmother, and together they had stayed up until around 1 a.m. watching a movie, which I just have to say, kudos to Grandma because I'm already in bed by 10. Deanna's exact next movements are not known. We just know that she snuck out of her grandmother's house and arrived to her uncle's trailer sometime between 3 and 3:30 a.m. She got her sister's attention by knocking on the window so that they could talk. Deanna's twin sister Becky noticed that Deanna had arrived in a brown or bronze four-door vehicle driven by two Caucasian or Hispanic men. Becky didn't recognize them and asked who they were, and she has a recollection of Deanna naming them as Tony and his younger brother Rudy. The sisters did not have time to talk long before their uncle woke up. After that, Deanna left and was never seen by her family again. I asked Melissa exactly what was known about how and why Deanna hatched the plan to sneak out that evening, and how exactly she got to her uncle's trailer. Given the time that passed between when her grandmother went to sleep and when she arrived at her uncle's. When you factor in the sighting of the brown vehicle and the two men, we know with some confidence that she at least eventually connected with those men referred to as Tony and Rudy to arrive. But everything else in between, there's several possibilities. For example, did she immediately leave on foot? Did she call for a ride?
It definitely could have been later. So, that could have given her time to use the telephone and call someone and say, "Hey, come pick me up." We're not sure that that's what happened. It also could have been that Deanna was walking to see Becky and somebody picked her up.
I also wondered, when her uncle woke up, did he actually see and speak to Deanna? Or was it just one of those situations where they heard him coming and they were like, oh no, gotta get out of here, and she just took off?
Becky and Deanna did not talk long before our uncle heard them talking, and he went outside and told Deanna she needed to get back home. I think at that time he thought it would be safe just to send her on her way, tell her to go back home, and she would go back home. And he was never one to tell on us. So I've heard people ask, why didn't he call your grandma as soon as he saw her? He wasn't a snitch. Like he wouldn't tell on us if we were, getting into what was assumed harmless trouble at the time.
The next morning, Deanna's grandmother figured she would let her sleep in, but when she hadn't stirred by late morning, she went to check on her and found her gone. After not being able to locate her or where she could have gone, she did call Deanna's mother, concerned. I can't speak for Deanna's grandmother here, but I assume she was feeling mixed emotions on how concerned she should be and what to do next. In one sense, she probably has quite a bit of feeling of worry at this time that Deanna isn't home, but she also knows Deanna is going through quite a bit and has been acting out and hanging out with a tougher crowd lately. We know that her grandmother does decide to report her missing, but the police response is underwhelming, I'll call it. And they just sort of file her away as a runaway and don't commit any resources to finding her. The path Deanna's case has taken, being on and off missing persons registries and police files, it's infuriating, convoluted, and unfortunately, not incredibly uncommon. Melissa told me how Deanna's case was closed, reopened, closed again, and then not reopened until Melissa herself decided to look into her sister's case around 2007.
She was reported as a runaway on July 22nd, 1990. In 1993, a phone call was placed stating that Deanna was home. Take her off the list. There was no follow-up with that. And it's my understanding that that was normal even normal sometimes now, where, a parent will call and be like, yeah, they're home now, they're fine. And they get taken off of the list. So in 1993, she was reported as home safe. Our grandmother found out about it, had her case reopened, and then In 1995, because she turned 18, she was magically no longer missing. So her case was closed again. And then, yeah, it wasn't until I reached out in 2007 that her case was opened.
Is your blood boiling yet? Because mine is. From 1995 to 2007, there was just nobody looking for her. No investigation going on behind the scenes, no cold case file for detectives to look at as time permitted, just nothing. But setting that aside, let's back up for another minute because what do you mean someone called and said, Deanna's come home and you can close her case? Who said that?
So we do know it was a female voice, but outside of that, we're not sure.
To me, this is a very important clue. Who had motivation to want to make this go away? Unless this was some sort of prank, which that's an odd thing to prank, whoever made that phone call was either involved in what happened to Deanna or knows what happened. And either way, they're involved in trying to cover it up. The rest of the story, I can't give to you in some neat chronological order because it's not how it played out. Remember, nothing happened with Deanna's case for years. It wasn't until Melissa became an adult and became determined to find out what happened to her older sister that the case even got reopened. So I asked Melissa to tell us about what that process was like.
So I originally had, tried to call and, was getting a little bit of the runaround. So I decided to just email, basically everyone in the department. And I think it was Sergeant Dixon reached out and said, I'm going to assign Sergeant Davis to this case. And at first, it took a while to really get things going. I think well, I hate to say it, but I kind of think they were expecting me to just go away after a little bit. I want to say it took almost a year just to get her in like the NCIC and things like that, and the Texas Missing Person Clearinghouse, but once they realized it wasn't just going to go away this time, Sergeant Davis did a pretty good job with what he had at the time.
In the process of getting her sister's case reopened, she was doing her own side investigation. Melissa began trying to talk to anyone to piece together their memories, her grandmother, her sisters, her uncle, any friends she could track down. Remember, Melissa was only 11 at the time of her sister's disappearance, and she had physical distance from her sister because she was still living with her mother and Roy. And Melissa's household was not a space to ask questions about Deanna and what happened to her.
I wasn't allowed to ask questions. It wasn't discussed. And even reaching out to my mom's friends from that time, she didn't talk about it with them either. It just was not discussed. And that was one of the problems with investigating her case and talking about her cases for a very long time. Anytime I talked about it, I felt like I was doing something wrong. Just because you weren't allowed to talk about it. Yeah, I'm over that now.
Melissa's mother died before Melissa began digging back into Deanna's case, and so any awareness she had of circumstances around Deanna's disappearance, or rumors she had heard over the years, or any clues that could have pointed Melissa in the right direction, those died with her. If you're listening to this podcast and looking for another weekly podcast to throw into your rotation, I want to recommend one I've been listening to, especially if you grew up watching Robert Stack terrify you with unsolved mysteries. Look no further than Unsolved Couple Podcast. Ben and Sierra started with the beginning episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. I'm talking Season 1, Episode 1. And each week they recap an episode and even provide updates to some of the original cases and mysteries you lost sleep over. So tune in and listen each week wherever you get your podcasts. When Melissa began looking back into the case, she tried a strategy that was new at the time but is used all the time now: engaging people to sleuth on the internet. It started with MySpace and web sleuth threads, and over time, Melissa and her husband Luke maintained a Facebook and Instagram page. They still do. It's called Finding Deanna. I'll link them in the show notes. Melissa found herself in new territory at the time, but her efforts have paid off because it's really gotten Deanna's case back out there and back on the minds of people who might know something. Even people who just knew Deanna and have childhood stories to share.
So when I originally started in 2007 is when it was really, social media was still the Wild West. It still kind of is, but not quite as bad. At that point, I would get random messages about what they did to her and to her body. And, I would have to have Sergeant Davis, follow through on these things. And it turns out it's just some, you know, random person who's never stepped foot in Texas and stuff like that. It's definitely gotten better. I think one of the biggest things is, some people will say, oh, well, she just ran off and started a new life. Who can blame her? But the fact of the matter is, a 13-year-old girl doesn't just leave every worldly possession and make a new life somewhere never to be detected, so that part's frustrating. For the most part, though, especially, recently, it has been much better, and we're getting a lot more, oh, I remember her, and memories from her childhood friends, and making connections with people we haven't talked to in a while. So it has been much better now than it was before.
The leads in Deanna's case over the years have been very few and far between. One downside to internet chatter is that it can work a bit like the telephone game. What starts as a partial truth or rumor gets exaggerated and built upon, and new details added, and by the end, you can't tell fact from fiction. I say that because there are several potential, what I'll call Deanna encounters. If you go on Reddit threads or listen to podcast episodes or read case write ups, there is information about people who encountered Deanna in some form, and if you read all of those without any context or knowing the full picture, you may believe she's still out there and that she just ran away to escape her life. When I share a case with family involvement, it's important to me to discuss the end goals of what we share in the episode and how it could help the case. And it became clear to me quickly in talking with Melissa that giving full context to these leads, dispelling myths, and getting accurate information out there is what was going to be really important. So I'm going to walk you through each one and share what Melissa has found out and getting to the bottom of them. Lead number 1 is what we will call the collect call, where Deanna's twin sister Becky received a collect call from someone identifying themselves as Deanna, who then hung up.
According to her twin sister, Becky, Deanna had or there was a collect call in 1993. And when the person identified themselves, they identified themselves as Deanna. And when Becky accepted the charges, they hung up. But then Becky got a phone bill that said it was from Cave City, Kentucky. I guess she lost that phone bill somewhere along the way. We did have relatives around Cave City, Kentucky. Our grandmother's sisters, I believe it was at least one of them lived there.
I asked Melissa if she thought it was possible at all that Deanna did make that call and that she was staying with those relatives there. She explained to me that Deanna didn't know those relatives well, that if she were to live with those relatives, it would have had to have been arranged by her grandmother, the very woman who pushed so hard to keep Deanna's case open and investigated.
Whether or not Deanna, I don't feel like Deanna went to Cave City, Kentucky, because our grandmother pushed so hard to have her case reopened and things like that. It just doesn't seem likely that our grandma, sent her off to live with her sister. And yeah, it would have been our grandma would have had to arrange to have her go there.
Something else I feel is noteworthy is that 1993 would have been the same timeline that someone called the police department in Killeen and told them that Deanna was no longer missing. It makes me wonder if this person was a female who completed a collect call to Deanna's sister Becky, only to hang up, and then the police department also get a call from a female caller who claims Deanna is safe. I wonder if these callers are one and the same, and if so, what they know about Deanna's disappearance. Lead number 2 is what I'll call the visit to relatives. According to the Charlie Project website, which is a database of missing persons cases, quote, between 2000 and 2002, a relative from out of state said Deanna had visited and said she wanted to stay hidden. The relative stated Deanna had gotten several tattoos. This story has never been verified, end quote. I asked Melissa to tell me if she could share what relation this relative was, and if this was even true. Turns out, this wasn't even a relative, and that's not the only inconsistency. This person's story has not stood the test of time.
A friend of Deanna's that, Deanna had stayed with a little bit while she was kind of, staying with our Uncle Jimmy and then staying with our grandma. She had stayed at this house too. So this person, when Sergeant Davis called her, she told Sergeant Davis that Deanna had been to visit her in about 2002 in Virginia, and that Deanna came because this friend had recently had a baby, but Deanna showed up on her doorstep with a tattoo on her neck that said Merryfield and a tattoo that said Texas born and raised or something like that. But Deanna told this friend that she did not want to be found. She wanted everyone to just leave her alone.
Odd tattoo choices for someone who's trying to hide their identity and be left alone, but I digress. Melissa felt suspicious of this lead, but police still thoroughly looked into it and considered it because they felt it was the only lead they had to go on. Melissa was able to track this person down on social media and have a phone call with her. Melissa wanted to know about her sister's visit to her. And this time, the story was completely different.
I asked her straight up, did Deanna come and visit you? This is what the detective told me in 2007. Is that what happened? And she said, no. She was in Killeen. It was, like 15 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. She was in Killeen and she had just finished up getting a tattoo. And Deanna had walked in and she was going to get a tattoo at this tattoo shop. And Deanna said to her, do you know who I am? And this girl said, yeah. And Deanna said, well, who am I? And this girl said, you're Deanna Merryfield. And Deanna said, that's not my name anymore. I don't want anyone to know who I am or where I am.
This is a tip that's regurgitated on the internet all the time about Deanna's case, and as you can see, it's mostly debunked. Or if nothing else, it's just lacking credibility because of how much it changed. And the consequences of these leads are not harmless because for anybody who may be on the Doe network or sleuthing websites who are comparing people who are, say, Jane Doe's, for example, they may not connect to Deanna's case because all over her files there are these very specific mentions of tattoos that presumably are made up. Melissa's been trying really hard to get these pulled off missing persons reports in files about her sister, but if you're a listener who is on the Doe network frequently or you're part of that kind of sleuthing community, please spread the word in the meantime. The third lead I'll refer to as the traffic stop. Apparently, in 1995, police in Hurst, Texas ran Deanna's name and date of birth through their computer system at a routine traffic stop. This again led to speculation that Deanna was out there and alive, or at least she was 5 years after her disappearance. But this is another one that gets spread around like fact when it's missing important context and, according to Melissa, has been debunked as being Deanna.
So the traffic stop, they later looked into the traffic stop and it turned out that this was a lady who identified herself as Diane Merryfield, spelled a different way. And she was, someone who had had run-ins with the law. But yeah, definitely not Deanna.
Number 4 is one I didn't get a chance to ask Melissa about while we were on the interview together, so you won't hear her voice for this one, but I did catch up with her to get the information. It's actually a lead that stems from investigation into another case, the 1993 disappearance of Danielle Pitcher and her mother Dorothy from Arizona. Danielle and Dorothy disappeared while on a walk. There's so many more details to it, but I don't want to get too far off track when I'm discussing this case. But one lead surfaced in the case where it involved a creepy neighbor of theirs. Rumor had it that this neighbor may have abducted both Danielle and her mother Dorothy, and that he had killed Dorothy and held Danielle captive as a sex slave, which is terrible. Other rumors were that he had held another girl captive prior to Danielle and that she was a runaway from Colleen who had been picked up on the roadway. According to these podcast episodes and Reddit threads and online chatter, the person in question was Deanna Merryfield, and part of how they had deduced this was that one witness had claimed that the captive girl was named Deanna. The other part used to substantiate this theory is that allegedly when Deanna was visiting with Becky at the trailer on the night of her disappearance, she told Becky she was out to make money that night and was headed to Arizona. Melissa has spoken to Becky, and Becky has shared that she never stated those things, that Deanna never told her she was going out to make money, and that all of that part is just false. So how this information was pulled together, I don't know. Melissa is unsure if detectives from Colleen ever looked into this lead for Deanna, but it's her personal opinion that Deanna's case is not connected to this lead or at all to Danielle Pitcher's case. So now that we've debunked or clarified a lot of the common talking points out there, let's discuss a couple of possibilities and theories in Deanna's case. Number 1 could be the runaway theory. Early on, police did believe that Deanna was a runaway. She had a troubled home where she had been sexually abused and experienced intense trauma. She was running with a tough crowd, and all the signs do show that initially on that evening, she did leave on her own to sneak out of the house. Having said that, Deanna's social security card has never been used again, or her social security number, rather. She was 13 years old. She had no money. It's hard for a grown adult in today's very tech-available world to find the resources to change their whole identity and start over, much less doing so and doing all of that as a young teen in the year of 1990. When I was talking with Melissa and her husband Luke, they both shared why they don't even really like the term runaway, and that if a child is running away, you should be asking more questions and looking into more things, not less. Here's Melissa and her husband Luke.
The whole runaway versus missing, the thing you say a lot is like, if they ran away for a reason. It's so that, especially that.
I don't like using the word runaway. She's missing. I have no reason to believe that she ran away. But even if she did run away, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in any runaway case. It's still someone who's missing, and they still need to be found.
I couldn't agree with them more. A second possibility is that Deanna may have encountered a random predator, killer, sexual predator that night. Because the identities of the men in that vehicle with her that night have never been figured out, we don't know if they had anything to do with what happened to her. Is there a strong possibility? Sure. But they also could have taken her somewhere and dropped her off where she encountered somebody else. The men in the vehicle were not people that Becky recognized, and nobody of her sisters or family knew any of the names Tony or Rudy or brothers known by those names. But Deanna did seem familiar with them. Tony and Rudy, if you're listening to this and you have a piece to the puzzle, but you've been too scared to come forward because you're worried about getting tied up or blamed for something, now is the time to come forward. Melissa just wants answers, and you could hold really important information. But pivoting back to, what if Deanna encountered a random killer that night? Or what if those men were? It's possible, Texas had an alarming number of serial killers active in the area at this time, some of whom have never even been identified. And we know that Killeen itself had a high crime rate. Kenneth McDuff was one of them and is sometimes brought up in Deanna's case. McDuff committed murder and was on death row, but due to prison overcrowding, they actually reversed his death penalty and released him from prison in October of 1989. He would almost immediately begin killing more women and eventually get caught and sentenced to the death penalty again in a few years. So was it possible that he was free to abduct Deanna? Maybe. He went back to prison for a short 2-month stint for parole violation after he hurled racial slurs and threats to a group of black teenagers. And when was this? July of 1990. I don't have the exact date, but given that Deanna didn't disappear until July 22nd, he only would have been out to commit that crime if the parole violation happened in the last week of the month or so. So statistically unlikely, but like I said, because I couldn't find the exact date, I can't be completely sure. Setting McDuff aside, as I already mentioned though, there were other active serial killers and predators wandering the streets during that time. In fact, if there's anything I've learned sharing these stories, it's that they always are. So let's move to number 3. Given everything we know, you're probably wondering about Roy and if he was investigated. Roy was the man Deanna's mother married in 1986, who later was convicted of sexual abuse towards Deanna, and the reason why she left to stay with her grandmother. We know that investigators have looked into Roy, but beyond that, we don't know much. We don't know what alibi or lack thereof he had that night, and while a couple of podcasts and sources have indicated that Roy passed polygraph tests, that's actually not known. The investigation into Roy and the results of any polygraph examinations have never been made public. We know that Roy had a history of abuse towards Deanna. It's possible he may have been obsessed with her and that her disappearance was his final act of control. Or he may have wanted to seek revenge for her coming forward and getting him in trouble. Having said that, he sort of got a slap on the wrist, probation and registering as a sex offender. So it would seem very risky to escalate beyond that and further risk his freedom. But I can't get into the head of a man like Roy, so who knows? The possibility is still out there. Melissa shared with me the difficult journey it was for her in looking for her sister and coming to her own conclusion that she's no longer alive.
People use those things like the tattoos, the phone call, the traffic stop as signs of life for Deanna. But if we're being realistic, and I it's not going to be solved if we're not being realistic. If we're being realistic, Deanna probably didn't survive that night. And it took me a very long time to kind of come to that conclusion and realize, if she were out there, yeah, we would know by now.
Melissa is actively pushing forward for answers on Deanna's case. In fact, when we were nailing down a time for her interview, she was telling me how unpredictable her schedule can be because sometimes she may just get a new lead that she needs to look into on any given weekend. In talking with Melissa, I can tell she's hopeful. She is working with investigators and they're making headway. But in the meantime, she is hoping that those out there who know something will come forward to help her in this effort, to make this easier because it's coming up on 35 years. Melissa has reason to believe that Deanna may have attended a get-together not far from her uncle's residence after departing from there. So if you are someone who attended that or you know anything about that, please come forward. If you know the identity of who took her off the list in 1993, come forward. If you know who made that collect call, come forward. And even if you don't know anything about the case but still feel moved to help, and let's be honest, how could you not be after listening to Melissa and this story? There are still ways you can help.
So I think the biggest thing would to be, if you have any information, contact one of us, contact law enforcement or, the podcast or, me on social media. Just contact someone and share her poster. I think there are definitely people who know something who were probably, 30 years ago afraid to talk about it, but time has passed, and a lot of time has passed, and I think, things have changed and we can keep people safe now, and it just needs to be closed. Like we need to know where Deanna is.
Deanna Merryfield had the cards stacked against her, and whatever happened on that July evening in 1990 ended her hopes of a fresh start, an opportunity to build her own life, be at peace, feel safe, have fun, be a kid, and grow up into who she aspired to be. If you have any information on Deanna's disappearance, please reach out to Melissa at the places she mentioned or contact the current detective working Deanna's case. You can reach them by phone at 254-501-8885 or by email at nholtzclaw@KilleenTexas.gov. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing on sharing these cold cases, please help me out by leaving a review, sharing the podcast with friends and on social media, and following the podcast on your favorite listening platform so that you're the first to know when there's a new episode. I take case suggestions in my email at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Tune in next Monday as I cover another unsolved case, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.